Uh, yes, in case you didn't hear that, I have published more books than J.K. Rowling. It's one of those facts that's true and yet not significant. And I like facts like that. I also like, I thought about mentioning this, I like words that seem like they're the negation of another word that doesn't actually exist. So like uncanny is a word. But nobody ever talks about things being canny, like it's a very canny thing to happen, or like kempt, like that was a really nice outfit, you look really kempt today. Okay, that's not why I'm here today. Hi. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the wonderful Write the Docs for having me. For the next 30 minutes, I'm going to share with you what I've learned about making your code examples shine. I have the slide here to introduce Stripe. I get the sense, which is where I work, I get the sense from talking to people that you probably have heard of Stripe, and that maybe you've heard we have documentation, but it's all, lest you hear anything different, it's all me. Everything, it's all me. Okay, so I work at Stripe. I've been a technical writer there for 3 years. There are other writers on the team. In case you're not familiar with us, we're building global infrastructure for the internet, an economic infrastructure. This begins with credit card payments, but expands into alternative payment methods, billing tools, and the ability to create platforms. Now, Stripe is definitely a developer's first company, and our infrastructure is rooted into superlative code and design. This is our basic Python request for creating a charge. Starts with the API key, Stripe charge create, the amount, which is $20 here, currency, source. Source is like the card or bank account or whatever that's being charged. Throw in an optional description if you want. This is a clean, simple, powerful API. Now, as you know, a good product is actually its own documentation. However, users don't need products. We think they do, but users actually don't need products. Users have problems, and they need solutions to their problems. And that's where documentation comes in, mapping our solution to their problem. So we have nearly 300 contextual docs at Stripe, and the code examples there are a key component to it. We directly support curl requests plus 7 other languages and technologies. Those are just our contextual docs. Here's our API reference, which I think people have seen a time or two. For the record, we actually copied this kind of layout from somebody else, and then we got all this credit for designing this layout, but somebody was before us, as happens. Anyway, so this is where the Python example comes from earlier. We also have 7 other examples here, and that's just for this create charge request. We also have retrieve a charge, update a charge, capture a charge, and list all charges. So there's 5 methods, 8 languages, 40 examples just for charge objects. We probably have a couple of dozen objects. So we have a lot of code examples. Now that's great, that's ideal. But we have code examples written by any number of people, which means inevitably we're going to lack consistency. This Python code, as you might notice, uses both double and single quotation marks. The previous API reference example used all double quotation marks. Arguably, you should actually be using single quotation marks. This page also doesn't have a .NET example because it was written before .NET was supported. Our .NET library can do what this does. We just don't have that example. It's been my white whale project for some time to have consistent code examples across all of our docs. Not only consistent, but demonstrating best practices. And we're not there today, as this relatively recent screenshot can prove, but we've made a lot of progress in the last year using the processes and techniques I'm going to talk about today. Now, as can happen, I've been working on Stripe on the docs for 3 years, and I've only really formally thought about our code examples in any kind of coherent way recently. Possibly since about January when this talk got accepted. That's probably the framework in which I've really thought about our code examples. And what I realized was, making your code examples great the key is to generally think about your code examples as you think about any other facet of your documentation. I would bet that everybody here knows what makes great documentation. Take a lot of that same thinking and apply it to your code examples, and I think the results will be great. But for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to start with users first, treat your code like you treat your writing, and then automate within reason. Broken down another way, this is a planning stage, followed by another planning stage, followed by the efficient execution of those plans. The great thing about being here yesterday is I'm going to skip the next 10 minutes of this presentation and tell you to watch Kat and Jen's talks from yesterday morning, because everything they said about building empathy and user research, all of that stuff was right on target. And I'm not going to do better than that. So I would definitely recommend you see what they said yesterday. I am standing here and I rehearsed this, so I'm going to go ahead and go with these, but really make sure you see their talks. I'm going to go off script for one moment, but you got to promise, everybody here has to promise. When you come apply to work at Stripe, you're going to pretend you never heard what I'm about to tell you, because this is how I make the hiring decision for whether or not somebody's Here's what happens. We have this process. Seriously, you got to swear. You can't tell. I have a bad memory, so you can actually probably tell. Okay. So we have this interview process. We have live writing. We have all these. You actually come in, and we're going to do a live writing exercise with you. And I know that I'm dealing with a natural writer or a well-trained writer when they look at me and they say, who is the reader? Right? That's what I want to hear. Who is the reader? Because it all starts there. Now, it's all going to start there with your documentation, with your code examples as well. This means three things. Research your audience, establish what you're going to support, and envision the enhancements you're going to add. To research your audience, start by figuring out the languages they're using. Now, this isn't just what programming languages, but in what percentages or degrees. If you have more Python users than Ruby users, you probably want to default to showing your Python examples first. Next, figure out their experience level. Are they junior developers? Are they mostly using WordPress plugins? Knowing your audience and their experience level allows you to better tailor that experience. Now, there's an interesting judgment call here, though, in that you don't necessarily want to go to the lowest common denominator. You're going to want to think about not just who the audience is, but who you're trying to target. And I'm going to get back to that. Research their goals. What is it they are trying to do? Why are they looking at your docs? And what are the problems they are trying to solve? And then, is there anything about their role within the organization? Are they just developers? Are they also decision makers? Are they people who don't like code? They may appreciate it if you have some sort of hey, go see this. Next, research. Take that research and figure out what you're going to support. Now, you might think this is what our users are, and we're going to support exactly that. And that's not necessarily the case. So it starts with the languages, but it also includes the language versions. Python 2 versus Python 3. And again, you may not do a one-to-one map. With Stripe, we have all these examples with curl requests because it's low-level and universal. We really don't expect people to be doing all curl request integrations of Stripe, right? We also have a lot of Haskell users, but we don't have a Haskell library yet. So it's not necessarily these are our users, this is what we're going to do. Also identify the frameworks you're going to target. Now with vanilla PHP, if you're making a web example, you can actually just use vanilla PHP and that's going to be fine. But if you're doing a web example in Python, you're going to need to use a framework, and you're going to need to make that decision. So here we say we're using Flask. These are all things you should identify. I like the part where I said It's actually in the note. That's why I said it. So looking inward, you want to make a decision about your library versions that you're going to support and the API versions, assuming you have a versioned API as we do. So we show all of our code examples in the most current version of the library and API, but we also, in our API reference, we're going to call out like, hey, you're using an older version, so what you're seeing here may not match your actual experience. I think in an ideal world, we'd like to have all of our code examples that all users see be like in exactly their API and library version. It's a lot of work. We're not there yet, but I think that's what we'd like to get to. Last recommendation is to envision enhancements. This is specifically for the code examples, and this is where you can really, really win over your users. Go beyond just being functional. Like, the sky is the limit. Brainstorm. What could you do that could make your users' lives easier? And the first best example is to make them copy and pastable. So when I'm logged in, contrast isn't great. When I'm logged in, I would see this code example. That is my actual test API key in that code example. Or it was my actual test API key until like last Friday when I thought maybe it'd be a good idea to change that. If you're not logged in, you're going to see this. This is a Stripe demo account test API key. So 2 different results. More so, the data we're dealing with is actual data. So the customer ID, when I'm logged in, that's an actual test customer ID from my account. The customer ID, when I'm not logged in, that's an actual test customer ID from the demo account. The end result is, whether I'm logged in or not, I can copy either of these 2 examples and run it and get an actual customer object back. It's a really nice thing. It may not actually be obvious to everybody, so you may want to say something that says, hey, this is actually meant to be you, or log in to see your stuff. You'd be surprised the number of times that people write in and say, wait, why is my API key in your documentation? That seems, what's going on? So it's okay, really. Now, a step better than having the examples be copy and pastable is to make them actually run right then and there. We do this using RunKit. This is a code example on our homepage. It is a complete example with the creating a charge. You click run, and it's going to show the results right there. It's going to run a request against the API and get the results back. All of this is editable. Like, I could change the amount, the currency, the version of node, and run it and see the results. Now, in some cases, like, it can't be 100% copy and pastable. That's just logical. So with our Connect platform, a Connect platform allows one platform to use the entire Stripe API on behalf of another account, with their permission, of course. And to do this, you actually provide the connected account ID in the request. Now, we can't always pre-fill examples that are going to have a valid connected account ID. What if I'm logged in, but I don't have a Connect platform? So in this case, we've decided to use placeholder values, which is just like a template syntax, double curly braces, all caps. So it says, hey, you actually need to put something here. But it doesn't actually say that. It kind of implies that. And people might be confused because it looks kind of like a PHP constant or a weird JavaScript object. So we add a mouse over that says, hey, replace this with an actual Connect account ID when you go to run this. Not only does it say that, but it actually gives you a sense of what that data is going to look like. Here it's account underscore something. So there's a lot more we could do along these lines. But as you want to create code examples that are ideally perfect and usable, do what you can to predict the questions that your users are going to ask and answer them in advance. Your users and your support team are really going to thank you for thinking to do that. So I encourage you to begin thinking about your code examples starting with your users. I also encourage you to revisit Kat and Jen's talks. Research your audience, establish what you'll support, and envision enhancements. For the second planning step, let's look at the code examples within the context of the docs themselves. Now, somewhat of an epiphany for me was realizing that how many of the same strategies that we use for documentation for the written content also apply to the code examples. If you adopt that mentality, it's actually going to make it a lot easier to get good results. Specifically, I'm recommending you define a style guide for your code, communicate through your code, and use this as an opportunity to give feedback to your engineers. Now, anybody here not have a style guide for their docs? A couple people, but most of us live and die by our style guides. Anybody have style guides for their code examples? A handful, right, great. For the rest of you, think about creating a style guide for your code examples. Ours starts off with general rules for naming, order of parameters, how you reference the API keys, placeholder values, which I just showed you, and comments. For example, have a rule about when you do and do not use comments in your code. For us, we use comments primarily for pointing out things that are not obvious or situations in which it's not going to copy and paste perfectly. Make a comment about that. Next, our style guide goes into specific rules for each programming language we support. This starts with how you name variables and functions in that language, what kind of fancy hash array object, those kind of things, syntax you're going to use. Like we just switched from the Ruby hash rocket to the Ruby JSON. Parentheses and braces placement, use of single and double quotation marks. I think we're actually going to single for everything but Go, Java, and .NET. The indentation rules, 2 spaces, 4 spaces. This may seem trivial, but when you have a real Go programmer come copy your code example and they see you're doing something that's essentially asinine or shows that you don't actually know what you're talking about with Go, that's going to reflect poorly on you. And if unsure, use this resource. Our style guides probably say, hey, if it doesn't say what to use, go ahead and use the Chicago Manual of Style, right? Do that with your code examples. So for Python, if there's a rule there that's not actually listed, there's something that's not listed, we say go use PEP8. PEP8 is a common resource for Python users. And anything else we can think of, which is language version, framework, that kind of stuff. Our style guide also has 2 sample code snippets, one kind of simple, one multi-step. And this is just a quick reference of everything that's in those rules in a pictorial version. So if I'm doing a node example and I forget what kind of quotations or indentation to use, I can just go look at this. Our style guide actually runs on an internal doc service, and this is where this is taken from. Now, the second way you should treat your code examples like you're writing is as another method of communicating, besides the literal text. Documentation doesn't just tell your users how to use your product, it's also going to tell a story of who your organization is, what it does, and what it values. Now, your code examples should do this too. At Stripe, we value clean, well-designed code using today's best practices. So we want our examples to do that. This is our Ruby create a charge example. This one's actually fairly complicated because you have to get a token, so that's 3 lines added there. This is another company's Ruby create a charge example. I'm not going to name them. And actually, as you can tell, I made the font a little bit smaller, and it goes down beyond the page. If I'm being fair, their example does way more than our example. It uses all the parameters, it does error handling, it does all this other kind of stuff. But this isn't their bells and whistles example. If I go to this company's site and look up a create a charge example in Ruby, that's what they're going to show me. And if I go to our site and look it up, that's what I'm going to get. Now, I may be biased here, but I feel like one of these says, we are simple and easy to use, and one of these does not. It's the one on the left. So the code example can also visually improve the readability of your page. Just like images or tables or lists, it's a way to break up text. It's another tool in your toolbox that you can consider using, so it's not just a wall of text that you're giving people. Third way you're going to treat your code as you treat your writing is as a motivator for providing feedback to your engineers. So just like over-explaining a product in your documentation is a smell test, so can requiring too much or convoluted code. That might be wait, this product seems a little bit off. You can also use code examples to find inconsistencies that engineers may not have noticed. That might be within a product or across multiple products. So like the Go example for subscriptions uses DEC for subscriptions uses DEC for description, but over here we use the word description. We ought to make these consistent. And defining shortcomings. Where you thought when you were creating a code example that the product would do X, but it doesn't, you can take that to your engineers. So I encourage you to think about your code examples like you think about your writing. Define a style guide, use the code examples to communicate beyond just what the product is, and use it as a motivation to give feedback to your engineers. So those are the two planning stages. Users first, and then the code in detail. This leaves a question of how in the world do you create and maintain hundreds upon hundreds of code examples in multiple programming languages? And how do you do that so that they have all those enhancements that you like and they are keeping with the style guide? Our solution at Stripe has been to automate that process, which is great, but I would recommend that you automate within reason. So this is going to come down to three things. Generate your code examples programmatically, run and automate your tests, and avoid pitfalls, which is where the within reason comes into play. Now, it's just impossible to do this by hand, right? It's going to take forever, and you're going to get riddled with bugs and inconsistencies and all sorts of problems. So write your own tool that makes code examples for you. At Stripe, we have two. One automatically does it on the fly within the documentation, and the other manually generates code examples that we then add to the documentation. So the first one is actually the API ref. The code examples on the right there, those are auto-generated on the fly. These aren't defined anywhere. Like there's no file that contains that text. It knows this is retrieve a charge, so for Ruby, it's going to give stripe charge retrieve, and for Go, it's going to get charge.get. Now that's wonderful, but then we get to something like our capturing a charge, which in Ruby, I'm sorry this is not more visible, is retrieve and then capture. And Go, it's actually just capture. So now we have to go in and override that automatically generated stuff with some hard-coded files to put in there so that they're going to be accurate. This is fine for our users. Our users are getting good, clean, accurate code examples, which is what's most important. But behind the scenes, it's difficult to work with. Has anybody ever had to run like a stack trace and a debugger just to figure out where some documentation comes from? Right, yeah, that's not a great day for a writer. That is not a great day. So if we go back a step, one of the benefits of auto-generating this stuff is, in theory, it's easier to like make a small change and it's reflected all over the place. But you don't actually do that often. You don't change your code examples that often. So I basically started wondering, are we actually getting not that much benefit by adding all this extra overhead? And so for that, we then moved on to creating a different tool. And this is a manual utility. So it's far less clever than our auto-generated approach, but it does away with that need for like overriding defaults and such. We wrote this utility in the Go programming language, mostly because it's crazy fast and some of us wanted to play around with Go. But with this example, with this utility, what you do is you enter a command, generate code examples, charge, create, blah, blah, blah. And it's going to output all of our code examples just like that. This is all stuff, it's syntactically valid, it has the enhancements, it adheres to our style guide, and is ready to be like copy and pasted into our docs as is. If you're curious, you can see like the little sample request.add keys. That's actually how we add the users or the Stripe demo account keys to that. So to make this thing work efficiently, we took our code examples and we broke it down into templates. So there's one template just for the API keys, one for the token reference, one just for variable creation, one for object and method, one for the parameters, and the little part down there at the bottom goes with the object and method we didn't forget about. So all of those are templates, and then all of that can actually be run through one of two templates depending upon how it's going to be embedded into our docs. The great thing about this system is, if we change our coding style guide, which we're never going to do, but if we did, you just need to tweak those templates and you can regenerate new examples. If we want to support another programming language, you just need to like copy a set of templates, tweak them, and now you can generate all those. Now, the only way to know for certain that your examples are good is to test them. This means running your actual code against your API to confirm that they return valid results. Now, we don't run ours against our actual API because that would be a lot of overhead. Instead, there's this thing called Stripe Mock. It's a GitHub project. This is actually our API in a like mock version. It uses the open API spec to know what our API is capable of, and it can even be run locally. And we currently test our actual libraries against Stripe Mock, and we're starting to test our code examples too. Now, obviously, you can't test your code examples using Stripe Mock, but maybe this is something you could bring to your engineers as a way of like, hey, wouldn't it be great if we had something like this? And you should also think about linting your examples. This is where you can get the spell check and all the other silly little things. We have some linting in place, especially in our API ref, but there's a lot of room to grow there. And the last point to make is to avoid pitfalls. So it's pretty easy, I think, to over-engineer things. And so let's try not to be so clever sometimes. One pitfall is we end up disentangling the code from the docs. So like the doc here says, this is a SaaS platform USD plan, and that comes from this ERB file. And then the code example actually comes from this other file. At some point in time, we've decided we want to call it something else, and we change this name here, which changes this name there, and now the doc has this mismatch. And that's absolutely what we don't want. Now, separating the code from the docs has some values. The reusability is great, but this is what we don't want. So find simple tricks like adding a comment to say, hey, like if you change this code, go make sure that the doc is staying consistent with it. So that's just one pitfall. I also caution against over-automating as well. So, and there you have 30 minutes or 28 minutes of what we figured out at Stripe for making your code examples shine. Start with your users, treat your code like you're writing, and then automate within reason. Thank you very much for your time this morning.